Hello, my name is Hitt, and it's good to be with you, even in this remote 2021 virtual kind of way. I'm a fish biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Eastern Ecological Science Center in West Virginia, and today I wanted to talk about some recent work that I think has some relevance for how we think about conservation planning in rivers and how we think about climate change and land use change and understanding those changes based on the ecology of fish species. So without further ado, let me show you some slides. Okay, so we are talking about the Potomac River system today. It's a place I'm sure many of you on this call know and love. It's a place that I'm fortunate to get to spend some time in working with my colleagues at Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who are important collaborators in this work. So we wanted to frame this problem based on some theory, some life history theory. Life history just references the idea that there are different strategies that can enable survival and reproduction in species that are evolutionarily stable. Here are three evolutionarily stable strategies that were first identified by Weinmiller and Rose, and they've been developed by others before our work. And we could think of them as three endpoints, three parts of a trilateral continuum: opportunistic, equilibrium, and periodic. These are different kinds of strategies. And the main idea is they have traits associated with them, okay? So a species that is an equilibrium species would be prioritizing juvenile survivorship, okay? Equilibrium, environmental conditions, stable conditions where juvenile survivorship is really a major factor. On the other hand, opportunistic strategist would be capitalizing on unpredictable conditions and very short generation time. So it's sort of the live fast, die young life history strategy. And then a periodic strategist would be basically delaying maturation and then investing reproduction when the time is right. Okay, so you can think of salmon, anadromous salmon is a good example of that. Now, on the East Coast, we could think of a representative species of the the periodic strategists being American shad, okay? Catfishes are a good example of the equilibrium type strategists. They have few eggs and they're large eggs and they invest parental care, et cetera. An opportunistic strategist, on the other hand, could be represented here by killifish. In other words, many clutches a year, they don't invest parental care, and they can, if they lose one cohort in a reproductive event, they can have another one within a couple of weeks. So some of these species can spawn, up to 8 or 9 times in a year, which is quite a lot of output, and that gives them an advantage. But there are trade-offs. Okay, so in the context of flows, there's a strong linkage here. Okay, flow, it's a master variable that drives a lot of the ecological responses that we see in aquatic communities. And so we could think about the increasing seasonality of flows yielding more of a periodic life history strategy, increasing stability of flows, so regulation by dams and reservoirs, for example, would tend to shift things towards equilibrium strategists. And then the critical part for today is that increasing variability or the decreasing predictability of flows, in other words, the kinds of things that we might see from urban runoff or climate change or extreme weather, would push this selection towards opportunistic strategies. Okay, so from prior work, there's strong evidence that when we stabilize flows, we see responses in the fish community consistent with this sort of theory, this life history theory. Clearly, with climate and land use predictions and observations, we know that extreme flows are becoming more prevalent, more frequent than in prior years, and that happens with high flows as well as low flows. So we're doing this work in the Potomac River system And this is an important place to be doing this because this is essentially a large river that's unregulated by reservoirs and dams. Not entirely unregulated, but it's essentially a free-flowing river, okay? It's an important tributary to the Chesapeake Bay, Washington, D.C.'s water supply, and it's extremely interesting from a fish biology perspective too, because you've got Great Falls of the Potomac. The Great Falls of the Potomac creates a fish passage barrier. And as a result of that, you've had the time for evolution to generate a lot of endemism, and you see some unique species, global endemic species in the Potomac, upper Potomac River that you don't see anywhere else. That's kind of neat. And that's a topic for another presentation. But for the purposes of today, the idea is that this is largely a natural flow regime. And so, for example, here's a section of the Potomac called the Needles section near Harper's Ferry, if you're familiar with that area. And you can see that the flow regime creates habitat, right? We see structural complexity. We see a lot of vegetation here. We see a lot of production, benthic macroinvertebrate production. It's a very hot spot. It's a hot spot for smallmouth bass fishing, for example. And that's largely because of the flow regime, okay? And we also know that the river floods. This is a good example of the variation in flows you see here. Here's a look at Great Falls of the Potomac, and you can see that it changes. Now, for the purposes of our talk today, the main idea is that high flows have a direct effect on recruitment. In other words, the production of juveniles that keep populations stable. Here's some work that I've done with Yoshiro Kano, who's at Colorado State now. And we can see basically that, in this modeling and simulation exercise for brook trout, okay, if we model a high winter precipitation event, the species is spawning in the fall, so their eggs are vulnerable and exposed over winter. If winter flows go up, and that event happens once every 5 years, well, we predict stable populations. However, if we see a high winter flow event every year, we are predicting a population extirpation. And that's the main point. It's not just that flows are changing, it's that what used to be more rare is now less rare. Extreme events are becoming more common, and that has ecological implications. So for today, we wanted to tackle a couple of questions. What does life history explain about temporal variation? And do we see changes here that we can explain based on this theory? So we're going to use some data from Maryland Department of Natural Resources. I'll model the temporal change, and we'll look at how life history relates in that context. Here's a set of sites. It's a great data set from 1975 to 2017, over 40 years of data. It's really fantastic. These were all seine hall data, and each individual and species was identified by Department of Natural Resources personnel. And what we see here, 250,000 fish in this data set. Richness and abundance is what we would expect. LEU stands for leucicity. This is the family formerly known as Cyprinidae, the cyprinids, basically dominating the assemblage as you'd expect. Centrarchidae coming in second there in richness. These are the sunfishes. So to focus in on some key species and some concerning trends, we see smallmouth bass numbers decreasing substantially after about 2009, okay? The color here indicates how far upstream you are. And so we see these trends happening across the map. Also note that they are highly synchronous patterns, which suggests abiotic drivers, okay, environmental drivers, right? Because if one site goes up, the other sites go up. One site goes down, the other sites go down. That suggests there's something fundamental happening in the river. We also see some patterns here where rainbow darter, this is a known introduced species. It's taking off recently. It's not a huge surprise. Banded killifish, though, is interesting because this species is increasing over time, but it is native. Why wasn't it more abundant before? We could ask that question. And same thing for stone roller, a native species that's been really increasing now in the river. So we are looking here at the temporal trends. So basically I built a linear mixed model. I won't go into details, but the point is that those red dots and the blue lines correspond to whether you're increasing or decreasing over time. If you're to the right of the black line, then you're increasing. If you're to the left, you're decreasing. And those blue bars give you some measure of how significant, how much difference between no change do you have. So there's a handful of increasing species and a handful of decreasing species. Let's see how they stack up. You can see banded killifish as an increaser, central stone roller, common shiner, etc. Mosquito fish, interesting one, increasing, decreasing. Tessellated darter, bluegill, smallmouth bass, and creek chub. Interesting. Creek chub are thought to be one of the most tolerant species, so why would they be decreasing here? Let's see if we can dig into that. So to organize these changes based on life history strategies, we can present a sort of multivariate perspective of their traits. I won't go into a lot of detail here, except to say that when we ordinate these species based on their traits, we can classify them in these categories that I mentioned before: periodic, opportunistic, and equilibrium. We can think about these in the context of their taxonomic variation. These are the families of fish from top to bottom. And we can think about their native and non-native status. But the most important effect, and I want to highlight today, is this effect of time, the year effect on abundance. Which species are increasing over time and which are decreasing? And you can see here that the opportunistic strategists to the right tend to be increasing. Those are positive values. Those are the values that are greater than zero. Trends are going up over time. In contrast, periodic and equilibrium both show negative changes over time. They're decreasing over time. Okay. So there's a link between life history strategy, how you survive evolutionarily, what is a stable evolutionary strategy, and what is happening in the river over the last 40 years. That's really not that long. We can also see that over this time period, there are increasing spring peak flows in the Potomac, okay? So this is prior work by the U.S. Geological Survey, Karen Rice and colleagues. And this tracks the ecological signatures that we see here. Now, there's more work to be done on this, but this is at the river scale. We can see there is a correspondence between increasing peak flows and the ecological changes we see in these fish communities. So to give you a couple of main ideas here. One is that there's a link between the life history traits, or these evolutionary traits, and the temporal trends we see in the Potomac River over the last 40 years. And specifically, it's that decreasing species are the ones that are requiring stable or predictable conditions. On the other hand, the ones that are increasing thrive on unpredictable conditions, okay, unpredictable conditions. So that's consistent with the flow trends. It's also consistent with what we know about land use and climate change in these river systems. Extreme flows are becoming more regular, more frequent. The past is not predicting the future, and that's something fundamental that we have to grapple with. If you're interested in this work, you can see more of it here. The work was recently published, and I'd be happy to provide a copy of this paper and additional data if you'd like to take a look at that. And I would also like to thank you for your attention. And I know this is a virtual environment, so I really do look forward to the discussion and following up with you on any aspect of this work that you're interested in. All right, thanks a lot.